we will screw it up in some manner. So this is between you and your lawyer and or rabbi. Otherwise, Scott will be happy to answer questions as well, seeing as he is in fact the author. So this is the joint OPSAREA-WG and Operations and Management Area meeting. These are monkeys on stage. This is the agenda. Actually, we have reorganized it somewhat so that address pool management and firewalls and internet security goes first, and then Joel doing an update on private enterprise numbers, and then some more stuff. Unless, Joel, would you rather do PN first? Someone else needs to go to the airport, so say no. Okay, how about you do it after, because. Okay, cool. And so let's get on to presentations. I don't know why I asked that and then immediately said, no, you can't, so. Would you like the clicky thing, or would you like me to? Sure.
Hello, everyone. This is Chung Sun from China Telecom. Here I would like to present a new idea, interface to address pool management. Next, please. Oh, yes. Actually, we are working with the Matt from France Telecom, Yudi from Comcast, Zhihen from China Mobile, and Will from Huawei, and Bijun from Tsinghua University. The current problem, it is not only the problem in China Telecom. We discussed with several operators. They all share the same feeling. Actually, we in the current situation, our metro network has a lot of BRASs. For example, the large metro network will have more than 100 BRASs in our network, and each BRAS need to be configured with the address pool V4 and V6 address pool, and the client will get the address from the BRAS. So currently, operators need to configure the address ports in BRAS in one by one. So this is will cost cost a lot. And the second problem is for V6 transition. In V6 transition, we have deployed some V6 transition technologies like CGN, like DSLite. But all these technologies will also occupy some V4 public address, and we also have to configure address ports in these devices. These address ports is different with the address port in the previous one. So we also have to configure a lot of address ports in these different devices. So it is very complicated to configure all the address ports manually. And the third, we also have some other devices like firewall, like VPN, should also be configured with address ports. So we think, is it possible to introduce a unified way for this address pool management? So here is the architecture. In this architecture, we introduce a centralized provisioning system to allocate and address pools automatically. So in this architecture, we need to specify the overall architecture, the interface from the provisioning system to the agent, and also in the agent, we need to inject the address pool into the routing system. So we now have the draft. We have this draft. I have listed the name. So if you have interest, I really hope you can read it. And we also in this draft, we have also listed the overall procedure, how to initiate, how to get a new address, delete a new address, and monitor the status of the address ports. And the next, we also defined a YAM model, data model. This data model includes address pool data model and the address pool status data model. So these have been listed in this another draft. And these are address pool management problem. And for another thing is about access service management problem. We are also trying to offer access service with a more flexible way. For example, we can introduce the controller in our metro network to configure different services for our subscribers. For example, we can offer bandwidth adjustment service for subscribers. So the users can order a higher bandwidth if they need. And we can configure the session limitation. So it will be easy to change the session number. And if the traffic gets congestion on one link, it can be changed to another one. So that can be achieved using this same architecture. So we also hope to define different YAML models for access services. So for this working group, we think we have the question if it is a valuable question and the problem need to be solved in IETF. Oh, okay.
So this draft is new, so I'm not going to ask how many people have read it. But if this is of interest to you, please do read it and comment on it on the mailing list. The underlying concept of address management may not be the right thing for this working group, but the Yang model may be. So please take a look at it and comment on it. I think it's too early to create a mailing list or the like, but it is worthwhile just taking a look at it. So please do that. And thank you very much. Oh, this Ops area working group. Oh, you mean let's see what people think of it, but maybe we can cross post to one of the int areas or something, to int or something, because that's where the address management tends to go. Maybe Fred has an idea.
I have no idea, but
you express it well.
But I had a conversation with the Sunset 4 working group chairs earlier today. This could be argued to be within their charter, not from the Yang perspective, but from the what does one do to handle V4 during, and when things are really crazy. And what they suggested was, in essence, that she start with a problem statement. Tell us what problem you're trying to solve, and that could be discussed perhaps in Sunset 4. And it might become apparent from there whether that's the right working group or there are other places that it might go.
That makes sense to you?
Okay.
So you know how to find me. So.
Yeah. Thank you.
Other comments?
Philip Matthews, Alcatel-Lucent. I was just wondering if you think that address pool management or address pool, sounds like you're trying to configure a bunch of address pools across a bunch of devices. And I was wondering if you think that that is somehow special, different than the job of trying to configure those devices in other ways. I mean, there is a bunch of work amongst operators these days, people trying to automate configuration a bit more. And it strikes me that that could be seen just as a subset of this more general effort.
Sorry.
You may have to clarify your question.
I'm just wondering, you're talking just about address pools, okay?
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, there's the general solution, of course, of having like a centralized DHCP server, for example. But it sounds like that those typically don't work with firewalls. It strikes me that the problem that I understand it is how do you sort of push the address configure the appropriate pools down to all these various devices that they should use, okay?
Yeah.
And that's basically how to try to configure those devices with all their address pools that they should use. And I'm wondering, do you see this as different than configuring those devices with other pieces of information?
Currently, I'm not aware of other methods to to configure these address pools automatically. Currently, we use manual configuration or some private ways. So, and the different vendors just implement in different ways.
Okay. So what I'm saying is there are some people are starting to look, some operators now, they're starting to look at more automatic ways of doing network configuration.
Yeah, yeah.
And I was sort of wondering, does this thing different? Do you consider doing address pools to be different than doing other aspects of address configuration?
What makes addresses special?
Yes.
This is address pools, but other configuration is address itself. For example, for DHCP, subscribers can get the address from DHCP server, but they can only get one address or a prefix. But for this case, we need to configure the devices. We need to configure, for example, BRAS, firewall, and they do not. I think the use case is different. They need a range of addresses.
Okay, I agree that DHCP isn't the right mechanism, but for especially since DHCP probably wouldn't work with your firewall configuration.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering if you had there are various operator groups. I just, came from a NANOG meeting recently where there was lots of discussion about automatic ways of configuring network configuration. And it strikes me that this is could be done by that mechanism. And I'm just wondering, do you consider addresses to be special, or could this simply be a specific case of a more general way of trying to configure devices automatically?
I think maybe it can be a general way, but
Joel?
we can discuss.
Joel Yeagley. I think I'm going to respond to that a little bit. I see pool management as a subset of a more general problem, which is overall address management. And the fact that we've sort of repeatedly crossed that ground many times without actually solving the problem, I think does suggest that possibly there's some work to be done here. So
Don't take previous failure as an excuse.
yeah, I mean, I think previous failure is an indication that the problem's not necessarily solved. So I think I'm somewhat appreciative of it in that sense. I think that along the way, it butts up against some other management and modeling considerations that pool management is a part of, as opposed to sort of standalone kind of activity. And so I think some coordination with respect to modeling address management is as part of configuration management and network element management, and in this case, an element, in this case maybe a pool, is probably in order. So I look at this fairly positively, and I think there probably is something to be got out of that.
I think what he's doing is encouraging your efforts. I think it's a good idea to keep going, but follow Fred's advice and define what the problem you're trying to solve is, and then the working group that Fred mentioned.
Okay.
Benoit Claes, maybe also one thing I want to mention is that please work on this. For now, don't pay attention where you should put it, because you came to me last time asking where it should go. I gave the advice to come here. Maybe it's not the right place. Maybe it should go to int. But basically, this is the problem of the people here in the management. We're going to find the right place if there's interest. So please work on this.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now we have Fernando presenting on firewalls and internet security. I believe you have 20 minutes, and I'll let you know when you've got 5 minutes left. Sorry? I'll let you know when you've got 5 minutes. Yeah. Shout at you.
Good afternoon. My name is Fernando Gont, and I will be presenting the ID on firewalls in network security. Before starting with the presentation, please let me give some background regarding this document and some clarifications. So the background for this document is that there had been one ID by Fred Baker that was published on this topic, and I think had been adopted by this working group that I found valuable. So one day I sent an email to Fred asking, what was the progress with that ID. and eventually got to know that, as far as I understand, the ID had been abandoned. Okay. Since I found it valuable, first I asked if they were going to revise it. They were not, and then I offered to, pick up the work and try to continue moving the ID forward, starting, let's say, from scratch. We are in version 0.1 of the ID. It's based mostly on the version that Fred had published, and it also incorporates changes and text from the second working group version that had been published. So that's essentially the background. And the clarification is that when we posted an announcement to the mailing list regarding this ID, there was a lot of discussion on section 1, which was about like history of security at the IETF. That was borrowed from previous versions of the ID, but I don't think that's where the meat is, right? So I think that the stuff we are going to change or remove or whatever that section in next revisions, but I think that the stuff that deserves to be discussed is actually the rest of the stuff that is in the ID. So what is this document about? It essentially tries to analyze the roles of firewalls in network security, tries to analyze some assumptions that we usually have about firewalls, and try to discuss a number of interoperability implications introduced by firewalls. I should say that myself, the idea that Fred wrote got me to rethink a lot of things that at times you work with, but you don't really think about them from like a conceptual point of view. That's the value that I saw in that idea. I think that one, besides increasing the understanding of all of us on the topic, I think that one of the things that we can take home from working on this topic is to help improve the state of affairs. And when I talk about state of affairs, all of us, one way or another, have seen or experienced a situation in which some protocol that needs to be deployed, it gets hard to deploy because of a side effect of the use of firewalls. There are times in which that kind of behavior is intentional, but there are other times in which that behavior is not intentional. And I think we could do a little bit better when it comes to the unintentional effects of firewalls. As I mentioned before, it's based on these two versions. These two versions were like very, very different from each other. So that's, if you wonder why I cite two different versions, it's because of that. They were very different from each other. Some of the concepts that are discussed in this ID is that firewalls provide prophylactic security to networks, and the idea is that many folks when they approach the topic of firewalls discuss whether they are of any use or not. It's like deploy firewalls or do not, and the point that this document is trying to make is that the role of firewalls in network security is like analogous to the service provided by the skin to the human body, in the sense that it provides like a first line of defense before other more powerful mitigations come into place. And those, of course, those other mitigations are more expensive. Other topics related to the use of firewall, and that this one is, you hear it very, very frequently, is that it violates the end-to-end principle. And this is generally an argument made by folks that are against firewalls, that they are necessarily evil because they violate the end-to-end principle, so they shouldn't be there. And the argument that was already made in the document that Fred had authored was that when it comes to the end-to-end principle, it's a plea for simplicity. It tries to argue against inconsistency, complexity, or stuff that makes the network more complex, but it doesn't really argue, for example, against the maintenance of state in the network, or other things such as, for example, retransmissions and the lower layers. Sometimes the end-to-end principle is taken as, it's completely forbidden to maintain state in the network, but actually it's not. Other concepts discussed in this ID are different types of firewalls. First one is context or zone-based firewalls. These are probably the firewalls that people generally assume when you talk about firewalls. Essentially, there is a perimeter that is supposed to separate between the evil nodes and the ones that are not so evil, and that's where the security policy is enforced. There's pervasive routing-based measures, in which the idea is that you have intermingled systems, and you kind of like try to isolate them with role-based policies. And then there's the other one, which at times I've seen that referred to as next generation firewalling, which is like a kind of IPS system in which you kind of like allow everything, but try to analyze, let's say, malicious traffic or malicious behavior. And only in that case, you get to, block communication or, for example, stop a traffic flow. What's next? Some stuff about firewalling strategies. This is well known. Two different policies that are usually enforced: default deny and default allow. Probably the most widely used for the general case is default deny, when you obviously deny everything unless it's explicitly permitted. It fails on the safe side when it comes to security. But of course, when you have those devices deployed, if there are, for example, new protocols or features that need to be deployed, quite a few times they are blocked, and it's hard to get rid of these policies. On the other hand, you have default allow, in which obviously traffic is allowed unless it's explicitly blocked. And it's essentially this kind of policy is enforced when you have like, in situations in which you don't really need like a comprehensive security policy. Like, for example, a place in which you want to filter the SMTP port, but nothing other than that. Some comments or discussions on the assumption on addresses and ports. In many cases, when you enforce firewall rules, there's the assumption that the addresses and the ports are stable to some extent or another. When it comes to address stability, this changes a little bit with IPv6. IPv6 has the concept of privacy addresses, which means that if you were, for example, allowing a specific system to get to a specific server, well, the addresses are going to change. And that changes the game a little bit in this respect. There's also an assumption about transport protocol numbers. We all assume that a given transport protocol identifies the service that identifies a given service. But there are a number of scenarios in which that's not really true. Among the possible examples, if you think about DNS server records, whereas the port is like dynamically mapped, or you think about port mapper, for example, there's no really stable port that identifies the server, but you have to dynamically learn that port. There are other applications such as FTP or SIP. For example, in the case of FTP, the data channel is it's a dynamic port, so you cannot really tell in advance what's the port that is going to be used for that. This means that maybe for quite a few applications, the idea that the port is stable, that you can filter the service based on the port, it works, but it's more of a shortcut or a kludge that it is of a general principle, if you want. And as a result of what we talked before about the assumption on port numbers, there's a tendency to multiplex applications on port numbers that are known to be generally allowed. So what you find is that, for example, if you think about port 80, well, it doesn't necessarily mean that if you are dropping packets meant to port 80, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are filtering web traffic, but it could easily be some other application that is being multiplexed or tunneled over port 80. Yeah.
Fleming Andreas, the previous slide when you were saying that with respect to protocol numbers that you assume that they're well known, right? The port numbers that are used. That's true for traditional firewall, but the next-gen firewalls today, they actually scan for protocols on a number of different port ranges, right? So there's deep packet inspection.
I cannot hear.
There is deep packet inspection taking place to identify protocols that are not just based on port numbers.
You mean to analyze the data, that they analyze the data stream?
Correct. Next-gen firewalls do that today.
Well, what we were mentioning before is, I'm not saying that it doesn't really happen, but it's not just that, for example, the case of the FTP ports, there were devices that could, analyze that since a long time ago. But what I'm saying is that quite a few times it's assumed that the port number is like static when it is not. And also at the same time, when you have a situation in which the port ends up being dynamic, well, the firewall device needs to understand the protocol that it's going to inspect, okay? So that's a challenge. I'm not saying that it's not doable or that you should do it or that you should not. but quite usually we assume that you can identify the port and block a service based on the port, and that is not necessarily the case.
Yeah, I mean, and that was my point as well, that, firewalls today, next-gen firewalls today, they do not necessarily depend on well-known port numbers.
Mm-hmm. Other topic is the state associated with firewalls. Essentially, or two different ways to do it is stateless filtering, in which case usually the decision on whether to allow or block a packet is based on that sole packet. Obviously, this scales well, but at the same time doesn't allow you to, let's say, enforce such a power of filtering, because obviously you are making the decision just on the contents of a single packet. Not to mention the fact that if you want to get deeper into the packet and you think about transport layer segmentation or IP fragmentation and so on, just looking at the single packet is not usually going to help you much. Then there is stateful filtering, in which the decision is based not only on the incoming packet, but also on existing or lack of previous state. It allows to do more powerful filtering. It doesn't scale well because, well, you have to keep state about the ongoing flows. And another topic or point that should be made here is that at times you get these devices deployed to protect, for example, like a server. But then this device itself, particularly when it's a stateful device, it can become the target of the denial of service attack. I think this is the final one. There are many firewall products that try to enforce protocol syntax, and this essentially means that if, for example, if you grab some protocol specification and there are reserved bits that are required to be set to 0, but then ignored by the system that receives those packets, well, these firewalls check those bits, and if they are set to a different value, let's say it's not 0, it's set to 1, they drop the packet. There are many unfortunate stories related to this. One is ECN, for example. At the time, it was hard to deploy, and there had to be like a backup mechanism, so to speak, because there were firewall devices that if the ECN bits were set, they would think that those TCP packets were evil, and hence they would be dropped. There's lots of this going on around DNSSEC, and there are other stories. So this is just blocking the packets, but there are devices that go a little bit farther, and they do not just check for those bits, but try to normalize the traffic, like what sometimes is referred to as packet scrubbing. In some cases, it might work, but there have been other cases like the TCP origin bit, in which it was essentially destroyed. I mean, don't need to get into the details of that, but there were devices that would clear the corresponding bit, and then traffic that was supposed to be out of band, all out of the sudden became in band because they modified the traffic flow. Comments?
Comments?
Lee Howard. So I'm working on a pretty thorough review of the document, lots of comments, so I'm hoping to be able to send that in the next day or so. It seems to me like there are several functions in here that I don't think of as being firewall functions, but other security appliances. And I don't know if that is I don't know how to tease out that as a separate component. We could say perimeter security functions, or we could say...
Can you give concrete examples?
IDS, or the last one was packet scrubbers. I don't usually think of firewalls as being scrubbers. I think of that being a separate appliance.
Yeah, I agree. So in this case, you could, so the packet scrubbing stuff could be a side comment. What at times the firewalls do, and that I consider is the first bit of that.
Higher layer bits especially, yes. And those are great things. That's one of my comments was in the first section that I've read clearly, you define firewall as being something that looks at packets basically based on layer 3 or layer 4 information. Some of this is layer 7 information, which can be a firewall function. And I think of that as being a firewall, but it needs to be defined. Your definition of firewall needs to include a layer 7 firewall function, as opposed to some of the other things that I think are a little bit different. Actually, the definition of firewall that you have says allows or prevents a packet from being passed. And packet scrubbing, you're actually talking about normalizing, changing the packet. So
Yeah.
there's a little bit of difference there.
I fully agree. This kind of like the note on packet scrubbing came out when I was complementing the part on the reserve bits. But this should actually be like a side note or a clarification note, if you want, that there are also devices that go further. But this is certainly not like a firewall functionality. I agree with that.
And so maybe part of my question, and it might be a question for the working group rather than just you, is should this document include the broader element of perimeter security or security appliances, or should it focus on what we think of as being firewalls?
My personal opinion on that is that for this particular document, I'll stick on what we think is a firewall to keep the problem tractable. Not because I shouldn't included it here, but if there was a previous experience moving this document forward, just focusing on firewalls, if you want to address all that, I think it's going to be much harder. Not that we shouldn't discuss that, but
two things. One is I wouldn't be careful to call a firewall perimeter security, because the mental image of that is perimeter of the organization rather than perimeter of some cloud like the data center or like a particular rack in the data center. But we have an AD interrupt.
Yeah, and I'm cutting in
we
front
get
of you.
XAD.
So this might be a question for you or for Lee or Dear or somebody. Yeah, just listening to that conversation, sounds like maybe we have the title of the draft wrong. Title of the draft might be perimeter security considerations or something like that.
That's exactly what I was
walls. It's
treat.
Perimeter again. I don't think that perimeter is too confusing a term to me.
Okay.
Because it's perimeter of what, and the general mental image is perimeter of the organization, where the perimeter could be much finer than that, like a rack.
Yeah.
The AD was here first.
So
but,
I'll let the AD talk.
And then Al.
Go AD.
Yeah, so I just wanted to observe that I think middle box taxonomy in the IETF is something of a full contact sport. But I think there's probably a big tent definition of what firewall functions are rather than what is or is not a firewall, because the things that I use as firewalls in my day job, and which are all stateless, most people think of as Ethernet switches, for example. And at the same time, you know, IPS and IDS devices certainly have ACLs in them. And those ACLs operate in conjunction, you know, when at layer 4 and layer 3 and layer 7 and occasionally layer 2. So like I think the thing to specify is sort of that what you're working with is kind of an expansive definition of firewall functions rather than with firewalls themselves.
Yeah, well, I think that one thing on which I think there was confusion when we got feedback on the mailing list, that people were confusing firewall, the firewall function with what a firewall device is able to do, which is totally different.
Right. But I think that the functional definition may or may not be more expansive than sort of what a firewall is itself. So I think we should just be careful there. We should also not kick off another more middle box taxonomy work necessarily.
Yeah.
Now that the AD interrupt has been satisfied, Al
Morton.
Cozy up to the mic, Al.
It's really high today, Scott.
And we're closing the mic after the two people are.
Right. So Al Morton is right now co-chair of the 25-year-old BMWG, where we tried to treat an update of our firewall benchmarking draft in the last, I don't know, we haven't done it in a while, but what we wanted to do, the gentleman proposing wanted to do, was to widen the scope. And so the term we used was content aware. And that covers just about anything you want it to cover. And I would suggest that you might look at that definition and see how you might want to fine tune it. But at the same time, I appreciate your desire to keep this tractable. And you're still going to need a definition for, that draws the scope around this. Firewall isn't necessarily going to do it. I also recommend you take a look at the drafts he wrote. It was, if you just look in the tools search under draft Hamilton, there's 2 drafts there that have some terminology, things that might be useful.
On firewall, the firewall benchmarking one, you mean?
Yeah, but we called it content aware because we wanted to go beyond what traditional firewalls did, and it is a cautionary tale because the work never was finished.
Okay.
so that's the keep it tractable part.
Okay, thank you.
Fleming Andreas, so I apologize in advance. I missed the beginning of the meeting and I only skimmed the draft, but what is your goal? What are you trying to achieve with this draft? And, you know, to give a little bit more context around this, I mean, firewall is just one of several inline security functions that you will find, right? So what is it that's unique about firewalls that you want to hone in on here?
There are different possible things that you could bring back home as a result of this work. First of all, are these ones that are mentioned here. Usually when you participate, sorry? Oh yeah. When you see a discussion on firewalls, for example, and that's something that that took place when we posted the announcement, like folks, for example, arguing that, you know, network firewalls have no sense at all nowadays, that everything should move to the end host, and that's where the, you know, protection should be performed. I think that there are things that are missing there in that discussion, and I think part of the stuff that this document discusses clarifies a little bit that view. I think that's one part of it. There's other things such as, for example, and I don't recall on which mailing list I saw this discussion. I think it was on an OpenBSD mailing list in which a guy was using IPv6 and he was complaining because his addresses were changing all the time. So he was like using scripts to try to reconfigure the firewall so that the firewall rules would be updated as a result of the new addresses that were being selected by the devices. That's an implicit assumption that, for example, in the case of IPv4 generally worked, but it's more of a shortcut or a closed. It's not something that you can really rely on. And that's stuff that we analyze here. I think that the analysis and giving this a thought is helpful. And then there are other things like when we were discussing this idea on the mailing list, there were DNS faults, for example, that say, yeah, well, you know, when deploying DNSSEC, we find that these packets are filtered, these other ones are filtered, and so on. And probably as part of the broader discussion that we are having here, for example, on this topic of enforcing protocol syntax at the firewall, I guess one of the, you know, possible spin-off documents could be like, you know, recommendations, specific recommendations on stuff that we know nowadays that, you know, firewall filter that are harmful. I'm not saying as a result of a policy, which is different. I'm saying that as a result of, for example, checking reserve bits, which end up making a lot of trouble when you want to deploy a protocol such as DNSSEC. And I think that recommendations in this area could be valuable.
Okay, so to follow up on that, it sounds like it's not the fact that it's a firewall that's doing that. That's really all that interesting. You have specific issues with certain protocols that are being mishandled by intermediaries, and that's what you want to document and come up with some recommendations about.
I think we might need to take it to the list just in terms of time. But what would be very useful to see is how many people have actually read the document. Can you? Okay. How many people are going to plan to read the document? Okay, thank you. Please actually do so. Okay, thank you. Thank you. I think that's the official end of OPSAREA-WG. And now we have OPSAREA, and I'm not sure if the ADs want to drive the slides or if I should sit here, and it's on my laptop, so apparently got lots of slides.
The slides are actually pretty shallow, but first I had an update on, yeah, let me find my notes here. Yeah, So one of the documents that's been before us before was an update to the IANA private enterprise numbers registry, which obviously features prominently in SNMP and several other protocols. As enterprises age and produce more MIBs, end up in mergers and acquisitions and so on, keeping track of the various entities that actually have stuff registered gets somewhat hard. And of course, new variants of the same company come back and ask for more private enterprise numbers over time. So there has been some work on the IANA side to update the policy associated with that. Unfortunately, that draft is actually not ready for adoption here or AD sponsorship because the IANA person involved in being the author has left the organization, and so we're in search of a new author and should have something in place before IETF 95. So we hope to bring the discussion about the pen registry back to the OPSAREA-WG mailing list here in the near future, because community input is probably required on that. Okay, that's it for the pen registry. Okay, yeah, Benoit?
Right. So I want to do a quick update on Yang. So actually, I did a full presentation in the NetMod working group. I don't plan to repeat the full presentation, it makes sense, unless there is like really interest. So who was in NetMod? All right, very good. So let me give you a quick overview, maybe in 2 or 3 minutes, of what we discussed there. And there are no slides, right? So obviously, we see a lot of Yang model these days. Maybe between 170 and 260, there is like a huge pile in there that we can extract correctly. What I've seen in the stats is that we've got more and more extracting correctly even during the week. So this is good. People are updating their drafts. We see more and more also from different groups. Recently, with discussion with BBF, they have like 30 Yang models. We've got some from the IEEE, from MEF, from Open Daylight, etc. So we're going to try to just gather all these Yang models because we want to see the dependencies between all these. And we did a tool during the hackathon on the weekend that will show visually all these dependencies. And by the way, if you want to get all the details, you can download the slides from NetMod, right? Something that become obvious as well is that we need to have a service catalog with all these different Yang models. They're not all maintained by the IETF, and that makes sense, exactly like MIB modules. So typically having a catalog in which we can point to stable URLs for Yang models. There is again some code there that was done during the weekend. It will be posted to open source. What else? We're helping people with compilation. Every single Yang model that I can extract from a draft, there is like a compilation warnings or errors. We send that to the authors. We're helping also, for example, with the BBF1. We had one of the Yang doctors helping there. Training. We did training on NetConf and Yang this weekend. This is currently posted on the EDU website. It will be also available on YouTube. Give me some time to do that. The next step is also to have a training on RESTconf, and also from a developer point of view, if you want to implement NetConf or RESTconf, these are our next steps. And coordination with different ZOs, I quickly mentioned that. The big step right now is to coordinate all these Yang models within the IETF. I'm sure that you went to a lot of working groups where the keyword Yang was mentioned. This is actually a good problem to have. Now, if I compare this with SNMP, where all the MIP are coming slowly, we need to solve this like quickly, right? This is the good challenge that we have. And I think that's it from a high-level point of view on Yang. So any questions or feedback?
Andy Veach, Nutcracker, quick question, because I don't remember from yesterday. You mentioned things that were important, and versioning was one of them. Can you just give an idea of what work's going on for that?
So versioning, there are multiple aspects to versioning. One is to make sure that, okay, whenever we post a Yang model, there are people who want to quickly update those Yang models based on code, etc. I'm thinking that maybe if we need to always produce an RFC in order to produce a new version, maybe comparing the process in the IETF with the open source, we might be having an issue, so we have to make it very simple. This is one aspect. A second aspect where it's important is that we might have supported by different devices or per applications multiple versions of Yang models. Typically, we could do service composition, right? In the end, we want to have services, but the operators will be testing. Yes, I'm using the interface Yang RFC. Great. But maybe I'm using a draft version of something which is developed in the IETF because I can't wait forever. And maybe I'm using something from the IEEE and maybe something from Open Daylight. And there is this service composition there. And if we want to go to service number 2, we've got a different set of versions there. That's a different aspect. The third one is a draft presented in NetMod where there will be like meta, we could have some metadata associated with the Yang models, like 3 version fields, major, minor, etc. These are the type of things that we should be solving. Make sense? Anything else? So that's it for my part, Joel.
Yeah, next slide, Warren. So I briefly wanted to talk about the state of activity in my side of operations and management. I think it's pretty obvious from anyone who follows the mailing list that DNSOP is kind of a hot spot at this point. With respect to activity in both things that are non-controversial and things that potentially are, that has impact if we don't expeditiously deal with it elsewhere in the IETF. So, for example, home net considerations may get backed up behind RFC 6761 BIS work if we're not careful, for example. So we need to be pretty clear about that. Benchmark Methodology Working Group celebrated its 25th birthday at this meeting, or I should say this year. But it also, I have seen it go in fits and starts because there's a level of activity and then it goes up and then it goes down. And through all of that, it has been shepherded by some pretty cool heads over time. Right now, it turns out that almost everyone in the IETF seems to want to characterize the performance of virtual resources of one variety or another. So it seems like that activity is going to be in the forefront of many people's minds for some time to come, not just people who sell virtual test equipment. On the other side of things, we have this working group and we have OPSEC, which have gotten most of their documents done. Next slide. Yes, because Warren is so incredibly efficient. Well, they've been around for a little while too. It's not bad to have lulls in activity, and it's also not bad if working groups don't meet. But what I want to try and avoid is losing critical mass that makes these working groups relevant and reduces their ability to do work. So that's something that we get to keep in mind with respect to where to house work and where we can get the best review and so on. I think one note on that, you can go on to the next slide, please. With OPSEC is we have a new chair. Eric Vinke has agreed to step on for that. He wasn't able to make it to this meeting now. There are some proposals for work there right now, but there's not a lot that's hot. So we may see that cycle in and out again. It was my first working group as a chair when I came to the IETF, or it may be time to finally merge it with this one. Next slide, please. Yep. OPS-AWG. Our illustrious chair, Scott Bradner, has indicated that he's going to step down after the next meeting. And so we're going to lose his steady hands as a working group chair, albeit I hope not a contributor after that. So we will be looking for interest in volunteers to put into that role. And if there are people who are interested, I'll put out an announcement for that fairly soon after this meeting. Thank you. Yep. Open mic.
Dan Romashkano, somehow related to the last items that you raised. Kind of curiosity, and there may be a history that I'm ignoring, but why was the firewall work that was presented directed to OPSAREA working group rather than OPSEC?
Good question.
That is, in fact, a good question. I suspect partly because the previous firewall work was done here. Why it was done here actually is possibly a good root question. And we have one of the authors here, and we have another one of the authors here. So,
question was why we were doing it here?
In OPSAREA, not in OPSEC.
Actually, when we grabbed the document, we weren't sure where to discuss the document. For instance, when we published the last couple of revisions, we announced it even to TSB-WG, to give you an idea. I guess the reason for which we chose this working group is because the previous version of the document was here. That's it.
Okay. What also helps that it's
Fred.
meeting this time, I suppose.
So that was actually a big part of it. Another part of it was that Warren suggested we come here.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. Excellent.
Okay.
It's all
Second
Warren's fault.
kicking the ball around.
question, and somehow related. So we have in SECM a document which is defines something that is called the security vulnerability reports, which is actually a use case. It's actually what operators do when they do security vulnerability assessment of their networks. And it's actually a use case which is considered hugely useful by the SECM working group, because it's kind of defining what they would need to do in their first version from a point of view of requirements. And we would like to send it to the operators community. And my question is whether to send it again, to send it OPSAREA working group, OPSEC, what would be the right community?
I think at this point, you actually probably will get slightly more security focused folks out of OPSEC than you will here. The overlap is extremely high. So I might not discriminate between them.
So sending to OPSEC is slightly better.
Yeah, I think so. But
okay.
You could also, make sure you CC OPS-AWG, or I guess it doesn't hurt to CC OPS-AWG to get, more people to look at it.
Yeah, I mean, at some point, like, people will get 3 copies of the message instead of just 2, but that's sort of a qualitative distinction, I think. Yeah. I mean, I managed to delete duplicates, but not everyone does.
A further comment on what you asked about the working group. When we published the initial version of the document, I was of the idea that regardless of the particular working group at which we were targeting this ID, that it might have been and might be helpful to have a mailing list, for example, to discuss firewalling stuff, because the topics that get that involve, we should involve like different kind of working groups and areas that I think are hard to get all in the same place. There's stuff, for example, that affect the transport people, and usually you don't find those people in the same group as you find the security people or you find the ops people. Somehow what we have tried to do was to announce the document in each of those mailing lists, but it's kind of like hard to keep the discussion all together by doing that. I think that even if from my personal point of view, no matter what's the working group in which the ID is targeted, having at least a forum to this. No. I'm saying that actually what I'm saying is that it's not that we have like an extremely good reason to go to this working group or another, but that actually the fact that this topic covers a number of subjects that span like different areas and working groups was actually a challenge. So yeah.
Yep. Al
Morton. Al Morton and Kathleen Moriarty wrote an internet draft together about the effects of ubiquitous encryption. And in the Prague open microphone, I got almost that far before people started yelling at me saying, we've already talked about that today. And it turned out it wasn't that draft at all. So now I'm back. I'm trying to tell people to take a look at this draft MMWG, effective encryption, the name's something like that. It was one of the things that they discussed at the IAB GSMA workshop, because it's mostly the mobility people that are jumping out of their shoes when you say encryption. But it's really going to affect a lot of things, a lot of useful things. Some organizations have gone deep into encryption and found out how blind it made them, and then had to back out some of it so that they could still manage their networks. And this is kind of a look over the edge to say, this is all the stuff that's going to disappear if you encrypt everything. So that should be of use and interest to operators, big and small.
Yep. Yeah, I think there are definitely concerns from specific communities about what happens when you do that. So for example, satellite network operators like to play around with the bits in the header, and they like to play around with the contents, and they like to do layer 7 through 10 kind of things to content in some cases. And they have a rather interesting perspective on what happens when you have ubiquitous encryption. That doesn't mean we're entirely sympathetic to them in many cases, but I think they deserve to be heard. But there are other cases where what goes down is your instrumentation. Right. In some cases, as network or as content providers, like this doesn't look that exciting. The difference to me on whether traffic arrives on port 443 or port 80 has more to do with the amount of time it takes to set up the connection than it does to do with my performance analysis, which works fine since I'm both the network over which the packets arrive and the terminating point on which where SSL is. So I get to look inside them. But yeah, no, I think there's a lot to be done there, and we are going to lose some things and gain some things.
No question about it. Oh, and satellite operators. Now I are one.
Now you are one, yes.
Right, thanks.
I want to stress this is a very important document. I promised myself to read it already like 3 times and I failed miserably. But I will try to do it again on the flight way back home. This is key to at least document what we're going to lose. And I'm not sure everybody understood what we're going to lose in terms of managing our networks.
But thanks for offering to read it, and I look forward to your review. And by the way, there's some urgency on my part to get this done. because Kathleen's not here for a really good reason. And then in a few months, she's probably not going to be able to work on this draft for a really good reason. And that would leave me stuck alone trying to do this. So please, let's finish it up.
I think she's going to have plenty of sleepless nights where documents that need attention will bubble to the forefront over all of her other considerations, right? So, yeah, no, I think we should be sensitive to that.
Yeah, good, thanks.
Thank you very much. I think we're good.
Done. Oh, does anybody still need to sign the blue sheets? If so, they're up here at the front. And there's one over there. Okay, then.